What's up, YouTube? I made a video not too long ago on my channel, a few days ago. It's in the past 2 days or 3 days, whichever it was, where I was actually doing a big investigation. Long story short, I've already talked about what I was talking about in that video way before I made the video, because I had released several videos talking about the same thing very prior, but these past videos that I made in the past 2 to 3 days was where I really, I guess you could say, simplified the argument and evidence to a much higher degree than I had in the videos that were made way before, that were released way before it. So yeah, ultimately, if you watched the past few videos in the past 2 to 3 days, you would have noticed that I said I was going to not stop there. I was also going to create a Venn diagram to represent the argument contained within the videos. So yeah, you can access those videos on my YouTube channel. Just click on to see the most recent videos released before this one, talking about the DSM versus ancient religious texts is what it's titled. And you can, take the time to consider the arguments and the evidence I gave. And once you've done that, you can see them in Venn diagram form here, like I'm going to show you that I'm making here. About to make it. And once that's done, you'll see an even easier way to understand the argument, because a Venn diagram is a visual learning technique. So it's intended to make this even easier for my viewers to understand my argument and evidence. So, for those who don't know, the argument is that the DSM is the authoritative guide by which we can safely judge what mental health criteria is, and as well as what mental illness it really is. If we want to know the criteria of mental illness, we want to know the criteria for any level of mental health. It's contained within the DSM. It's no coincidence that that's true, that all that's true about the DSM, because it is legally enforced by the entire world to be used by every mental health professional institution in the world. So, and it's legally enforced by the government in the United States, and it's legally enforced, which is the most powerful government in the world. And all people turn to mental health professionals who are using the DSM. In what they say, the mental health professionals that everyday people even know personally claim that the DSM itself, they use the information contained within the DSM to form their arguments about what mental health criteria is and what mental illness is, and what criteria has to be met. Yet, despite this, everyday people, deny this. They deny that notion, because they turn to their ancient religious texts. They'd rather choose it over the DSM. At least that's the case some of the time, because some of the time they do that, but then the other half of the time they switch back to the DSM. So clearly there's a discrepancy here that needs to be followed along with throughout the course of the video as I narrate the argument and the evidence. That's the discrepancy to pay attention to. Humans have, for as long as the DSM has been reputed and used in the major ways it has in the law, as long as that's been happening, people have been switching between believing in the DSM to ancient religious texts. The ancient religious texts, of course, have different things to say about mental health and mental illness that the DSM does not approve of. So clearly there's a discrepancy because only one is more correct about mental health, and that's the DSM, not ancient religious texts. And not only that, but only one would be safer to experiment with to begin with, and that's the DSM, not ancient religious texts. If a person was just growing up in this world, and the DSM was already by law, and ancient religious texts were around, I would think it would be a safer thing for the person to turn to the DSM, not the ancient religious texts. Because what can be found in the ancient religious texts is just about anything, any sort of claim about mental health that can be light years off of what's true, but people would still turn to it. Whereas with the DSM, that's not really the case. It's far more likely to be accurate, totally accurate in its judgment about mental health. Because you see, mental health professional services have to actually fix mental health, whereas the ancient religious texts do not have to actually attempt to fix mental health. So there's another discrepancy. Obviously, mental health it has to be taken much more serious by institutions, and mental health booklets have to actually intend and do the job right, because by law they're ordered to fix the mental health. Whereas when it comes to ancient religious texts, they are not. Those are not with the sole intention or with the hard intention of doing so. At least not as much as the DSM is. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's ancient religious texts that have many positive, helpful things to say that can help people with their mental health. But at the same time, they have plenty of things that are not so much that. Plenty of things that are quite the contrary and are actually worsen people's mental health. So ultimately, this could only mean one thing. It means that there's two discrepancies that show mental illness on behalf of the vast majority of humans in history. And the first one is the first one I was talking about in this video, with how they switch between two sources of information that can't both possibly be 100% right about mental health. And the other discrepancy is that just the simple fact that ever even turn to ancient religious texts to try to figure out mental health is already something you'd have to do if you were mentally ill, because everything you need for mental health is best presented within the DSM. Everything you need for mental health, to improve your mental health, is not presented in the ancient religious texts. And anytime there is something helpful to mental health presented in ancient religious texts, it also has the detriment of being presented quite poorly as compared to the DSM, where it's all the information is categorized and presented quite efficiently. So ultimately, those are the two discrepancies to pay attention to as we follow along in this investigation, you could call it. So, yeah, ultimately, I'll say this much. At the end of the day, while it may remain true that I've given pretty much all that I have to narrate about the matter. That's just a brief overview of what I reported. Now it's time for me to actually, draw the things I was saying into this Venn diagram. Everything I just told you about the differences between the major differences between the two booklet, not two booklets, but the two kinds of booklets. You can literally put it in this Venn diagram. Maybe on the left side I guess on the left side you could put the DSM, or on the left side you could put ancient religious texts. And then in the middle you write the similarities. You see how they both help mental health. And you see what they do the same. And then on the left and right you can read, be forced to notice that what I'm saying is true in Venn diagram form. It seems as though a Venn diagram is the only way to get the mentally ill species of my own to actually be able to comprehend the argument. Anything less seems to be something they can't pay enough attention to. But, so, let's see. I don't know how this is, where you'd put okay, so I'm just experimenting here with this. Honestly, I'm new to this, image editor where you can put text in. So now I see all I have to do is type it quite easily, zoom in at my convenience, I suppose. So, yeah, I'm just going to put ancient religious texts on the left and the DSM on the right and go from there. Okay, ancient religious texts. Okay. The DSM. Okay, so there you go. Now you see this is actually something I'm really going to do. It's something that I'm actually going to be able to do as well. It's something that's very easily doable. As if I haven't done this sort of thing on this channel a million times and shown it in video form. I've done countless visual aids to my viewers to help them understand my arguments. Okay, so now then, we put ancient religious text. So what's one thing we know about ancient religious texts? Well, they claim mental health shows that all people have always been quote unquote crazy and insane. However, never once in those ancient religious texts, as most people know, do they ever say that it is mental illness. They just say that it's craziness, or that it's ignorance or whatever. So yeah, I'm not sure if you can even change the size of this text here. Oh. Yeah, it's the most I could change the size. But you get the idea. It's not going to fit perfectly within the circle, but it'll have to do. Now, what's another thing we know? Now, what's something we know about the DSM? It says that, well, let's just keep going with the ancient religious texts first, and then we'll move on to what they have in common, and then we'll finish it off with writing what we know about the DSM. Okay, so ancient religious texts also say that they also say that you can trust in the government. That is, you can trust in any higher authority for what they're going to say by tell you to do by law. It says trust in the authorities, trust in the government. Yeah. So, or at least it says trust in certain forms of government. In other words, it's saying trust in the or trust in the government and give your power to the government. Okay, hold on a second. Just give me a second here. Okay, so here's a good example. All right, we have in the Bible, it says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." So, I mean, and all these major religions have a similar thought process about the authorities, because all these ancient major religions have a duty or some legal obligation to follow, which is to manipulate the masses through war and propaganda, as well as any tyrannical means by which they can deceive people and can, with statements like this about who to trust, as well as how to create more panic in their enemies' minds. And so it's just a lot of mind games. So, which is, the funniest thing is, well, here's the thing: the Bible does say that in the world, Satan is in charge, and that everything is under siege by the forces of the devil. But that doesn't mean it's saying that you shouldn't obey those forces. The Bible is saying you still have to submit yourself somewhat to those forces in order you have to surrender in order to undergo God's supposedly good, gracious plan. He's saying, don't worry, if you submit yourself, everything will turn out just fine for you and me. Do it, even if Satan's the enemy. Well, either way, it's according to the Bible's criteria for what justice is. If you were an average person and you submitted yourself to the authorities of the devil, which is pretty much being called one and the same by Bible lore, you would end up in the lake of fire for eternity. It's pretty funny, but it's saying that at least if you did submit yourself to the authorities, you'll have an easier time in life when you aren't thrown into the lake of fire. So it's basically saying that there's a benefit to submitting yourself to the authorities. It's trying to say that even if you do submit yourself to the satanic authorities, it's not necessarily going to make you become have a mark of the beast, or it's not necessarily saying you're going to be instantly. It's also not saying that you won't become. It's also saying that it applies to the ones who will be saved according to Christian doctrine. So it's basically saying everybody has to do it to take advantage of those forces for one's own personal gain. It's saying to resist. It's basically not really specifying it, but if you go by the Bible lore, it could be implied that this statement is saying, and this verse is saying that it's not necessarily that you'll become evil by Bible standards. It could just be this is a way to adapt to the regime in a positive way that God would approve of. Either way, though, the Bible clearly has to say something in this statement about how it thinks that the authorities are very likely to be trustworthy in what they are willing to provide to the lower class, to all the social classes, and what sorts of benefits they're willing to provide, so that they can be trusted. Which implies that they are saying that they can be trusted for mental health professional services. You can take that as far as you want, because the more trustworthy a governing body is to the public, the more likely it is to have to actually provide something as great as actual legitimate mental health professional services. But it's actually guaranteed, because you see, ultimately, in order to regardless of how much corruption there is, the government has to also not just be corrupt, but they have to be genuine as well in order to get away with being corrupt. So this doesn't just apply to the corruption, it applies to the genuine of the government. So, which pretty much guarantees they would be genuine about mental health, because they have to be they'll do everything they can to pass off as 100% genuine, and in doing so, they wouldn't want to make it seem like they're not genuine at all, ever, in any chance, unless it was one that people somehow wouldn't rebel against out of fear. But when it comes to mental health, they would if people believe that mental health was not being given professional, institutional care from the government, people would the system would collapse. So, so that's why it's pretty obvious that the government, no matter how corrupt it is, must actually provide some sort of mental health professional services to the public. I mean, they've been doing it since ancient times anyway. Whatever technology they had at the time was used. So ultimately, must be that ancient religious texts are actually giving a lot of credit to the DSM itself, because they're basically saying the criteria, they're really just they're not really giving anything that would, by that statement, they're not really giving anything that would imply that the DSM today or years ago would be wrong about mental health in any way. It's really just giving more credit to it and giving reasons that make it more convincing that the DSM actually is correct, and actually giving reasons why the Bible must be asserting that the DSM is actually correct. So, and if they really are asserting that the DSM is correct, then so are the other major religious texts, because they're all pretty much contingent upon each other, because they were used more as tools to just keep the grain in force and to not go against the grain. So they all had the same system of manipulation, and that's would have to be reflected in their statements, no matter how controversial their statements are. So yeah, that's that. And so it's pretty much inevitable that all ancient religious texts have been trying to say that the DSM is most correct about mental health. They're at least alluding to it So, and if they're even alluding to it, that's saying a lot. I'm not going to say that this is flat out proof that ancient texts are absolutely saying that the DSM is more reliable for mental health. But it is something that implies that they might be doing that, at least. And which helps support my argument and claims here. But what else do ancient religious texts say? What else? Well, I mean, they certainly have plenty of positive, accurate things to say. But to say that they have anything else here we need to go over is, I would say, a far cry. I mean, anything really that doesn't run the point home, nah. I mean, we already know a lot of what ancient religious texts say anyway, so you can put however many you want on there, and I'll put just a few things about the DSM. I'll put what I can fit in the middle, and then you will see why it must be true that ancient religious texts and the DSM are actually very different in what they say about mental health, even though most if not all people, have turned to both time and time again for decades in an attempt to try to say that they're both completely valid in what they say about mental health, when that's obviously logically impossible to be the case. I mean, ancient religious texts pretty much say that crazy isn't mental illness, because they say that mental illness and craziness is. Oh, well, they say, well, no, because the religious texts say that mental illness is only when there is a demonic possession, or a possession from some sort of supernatural force. They do not say that it could be mental illness if the person is merely doing absurd things that are highly irrational, because it says that they have to be a certain level of highly irrational before it's mental illness, which is simply a far cry from the truth according to the DSM. The same DSM which says any form of delusion is false belief, and any false belief is delusion. So it's effectively in that saying that any sort of false idea is delusional thinking, and it says any delusional thinking is mental illness. The DSM even claims it to be called delusional disorder. Delusional disorder is when the person uses any false idea and believes it to be true, when it actually turns out it is not true. So ultimately, it must be the case that the DSM has much lower standards for people in terms of what to expect about certain things than ancient religious texts. I mean, honestly, I think that the DSM has a lot more hope in people going by those claims about mental health. Much higher hopes, and has a lot more faith in that people can change and become better, whereas ancient religious texts do not. They're adamant on the idea that the mind is either physical but also non-physical, or that it's just entirely non-physical. You won't get one ancient religious text that says the mind is completely physical. You just won't. And that makes all the difference, because if a mind is non-physical, even partially non-physical, it would be pretty much impossible to cure that mind of any mental illness, or to cure it of any sort of, what do you call it? or to cure it of any sort of just mental issues, because it would be from a non-physical nature or form of existence that could not be changed, that would be generating its mental illness. But you cannot manipulate the non-physical in such a way that its mental illness is gone. So yeah, you really can't, if it was non-physical, you wouldn't be able to really get rid of the mental illness if it was a non-physical mental illness. If it was a physical one, you could just manipulate the matter and the atoms that were causing it with technology and medicine and with biological knowledge and neurobiology. But anyway, so here I'll add that in, which is that claims that the mind is non-physical and as such cannot have its mental faculties fixed. So there you have it. And the DSM, on the other hand, is very different. DSM. So that's about everything I'm going to put in for the ancient religious texts here. Now let me quickly do do what I'll put down for the DSM, and I then think that I'm going to need a new sheet, so to speak. Either that, or I'm going to have to put these somewhere else, because you know what? I'm going to have to kind of like redo this template, because obviously, as you can see, if I really wanted to fit stuff in the middle, I'd probably have to like fit them in at the bottom, like here. I mean, I'll try to do that. If it doesn't work, I'll just get rid of the other stuff, and then I'll just do a template with only the middle filled in, and the other ones will be gone, so it can fit. And you'll understand. So I'll just tell you that now, in case you're wondering if I do that. So I'm just going to do the middle last. So the DSM here is, we're going to say, and make this short. It doesn't have to be. I've already explained this in words several times. The DSM claims that any form of illusion must be any false idea believed to be a true idea. Claims that any form of delusion must be any false idea believed to be a true idea. What else? It claims that all delusion is mental. All delusional ideas are of a person's mental illness. Okay, and what else? It claims that the mind is or is likely to be physical and not at all non-physical. Or that it's physical the nature of it is determined by the physical reality it is in. So there you go. And the DSM claims that the mind is or is likely to be physical and not at all non-physical, or that the nature of the mind is determined by the physical reality it is in. That is a stark comparison to how the ancient religious texts will say that the mind is non-physical and as such cannot have its mental faculties fixed. Because how can you change the non-physical when we know we can change the physical stuff, but you can't really change the non-physical in such a way that if a mind was non-physical, it could be changed of its broken faculties. So, that pretty much sums it up. So there you have it, in Venn diagram form. Just a small, I'm sure there's way more that can be added in, but those are probably the most critical. Pretty much all what we would ever need to say about the two to know, and to make it easy to know that there's a discrepancy between them. Other than how I'm going to put, eventually I'm going to put something in the middle to show you the similarities too. But that'll be in the next video where I do that. Running out of time here, unfortunately. So, as I do have a busy schedule to keep to, and I do have a life, which I've shown and talked of many times before on this channel. But ultimately, that pretty much sums it up. Ultimately, there's no way that there's very much more to add in. You can add any amount of things into the diagrams you want about what ancient religious texts say, but those would just be not really addressing things about mental health so much as the statements I've put in so far. What do they say about mental health can be summed up in those things I put in the diagram anyway, so you don't really have to put everything in the diagrams. And so it's pretty safe to say that just by the differences we see between them, that there's huge discrepancies between what they both say about mental health. So the fact of the matter is, humans absolutely do turn to both, and have for the longest time, to try to judge mental health. So it's safe to say that they have been mentally ill to do so. And the fact that they would ever even turn to ancient religious texts instead of choosing the DSM when they had a choice between the two is also indicative of mental health issues, because one is controlled by medical institutions of the government to try to solve mental health crises by law, as they're being forced to do, and the other isn't. So if a person grew up not realizing that, that's quite foolish, delusional thinking. And what does the DSM say? It says any foolish, delusional thinking is mental illness, just as I put there on the last diagram. So clearly, you can do any amount of fact checking you want for what the ancient texts say and what the DSM says. It matches everything I put in the diagram. So yeah, but the other thing is, I also want to give everybody some announcement that obviously I don't want to stop here. I'm not going to stop here, because obviously what I can do is I can take things up a notch, a few notches, or quite a few notches if I want. I don't have to stop here making videos about this. No, I can report these findings to countless institutions in the world, and medical institutions or even non-medical institutions, and they'll be forced to comply. So your time is running out, and you're better off just complying. You're better off just complying to this thing I've had going here on this channel for so long, because your luck and time is running out. The mentally ill, that is the entirety of the world, will be no more, and sooner rather than later, if the things I'm saying are true. Either way. Well, either way, that's it for this video. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye.